Welcome, students and teachers, to our 15th and final episode of the winter-spring season of the Constitution in American Life. It's been an exciting few days since we last talked, as we have seen the opening of the 2023 Major League Baseball season, and my Los Angeles Dodgers have jumped out to an early divisional lead after 3 games, and have done so with games lasting only 2.5 hours. This is probably the greatest rule change to come along in Major League Baseball since lowering the pitcher's mound after the 1968 season. We are but a few weeks away from the We the People National Finals to be held in the great state of Virginia. We are hoping that our series of discussions that we have held over the past few months have been helpful as you prepare for this event, but more importantly, how you think about questions and issues that you confront as a member of civil and civic society. In this, our last session, we are going to be talking about one of my favorite and one of the more controversial, if you talk to anti-Federalists, clauses in the Constitution, and that is the necessary and proper clause. We hope to provide some understanding into the genesis, purpose, and impact of this clause over the history of the Constitution in American life, which in the end will allow you to counter anybody at future dinner parties who argues against the notion of implied powers. So let's begin this last session where we begin most sessions, and that is to probe the mind, wisdom, and insights of our 18th century history professor, Professor Tim Moore. Tim, Alexander Hamilton and others were advocating for a stronger central government in the late 1770s and early 1780s, but clearly few agreed with him. Yet by 1787, advocacy for a stronger national legislature became more acceptable. What conditions and/or factors contributed to that change in attitude over 7-8 year period?
Well, first of all, I'd like to comment on the dinner party. I've been to a lot of dinner parties, and I don't know that the necessary and proper clause has ever, or implied powers for that matter, have come up. But we can always hope. So maybe
that's why you're happy you live 2,000 miles away from me, because those would be my dinner parties.
What if someone brought ketchup to the bratwurst party? Necessary and proper.
Well, there is some debate about that, even within this group, on whether ketchup is a viable condiment for that. But we'll leave that aside. Even though
we should leave it off the broad.
Even though it may be the more important issue in all of this, frankly. But no, you're right, David. Hamilton is not happy with the Articles from the get-go. There's some great letters that he writes in the 1770s, expressing his discontentment with it. He wrote a couple letters to George Clinton, the governor of New York, complaining about New York's lack of supplying the requested funds. He writes letters to other people about why, Robert Morris has a circular letter to the governors. Hey, you're not sending in the requested funds or your militia quotas that we've been asking, the Continental Congress has been asking for. So, yeah, straight out of the chute, there's Hamilton kind of leads. There are other voices, but I think it's fair to say that he kind of is the head of the pack. But some of the factors that lead to this, by the mid 80s, I think by and large, economic factors are a fair thing to consider as one of the most, or perhaps the most important factor. We're not being able to pay interest on our debt that we have to ourselves as well as to foreign nations. That's a problem. We have the failed attempts to amend the Articles. There's about half a dozen of those. Paper money is an issue on how destabilizing that is for debtors and creditors. It happens in both New Jersey and Rhode Island. Madison calls this the rage for paper money as a very destabilizing, and so it's a threat. there's a lot of fears about, can we get the British out of the forts on the Great Lakes and in the Western territories? They're not, they're not agreeing to that. The point is we can't even enforce the Treaty of Paris on that part, that agreement that they had. There's also I think there's a tipping point when a lot of people are hearing these things occasionally in newspapers about wanting a monarchy. I think that factors into a tipping point. Washington was aghast at this, that this was being proposed and that he was mentioned as the guy. The wrangling of Congress over foreign diplomats, the Silas Deane controversy, whether he was corrupt or not as a French diplomat, the factions within Congress over that Deane. There's a faction that was called the Deane Lee, Arthur Lee faction. So Congress is highly divided during the 80s. I think there's a lot of factors that go into this reconsidering of can we go along with our current system? And the nationalists look at all of these factors and say we've got to do something, and the time is right. Now, there were attempts prior. New York called for a convention in '82. There were efforts to get commercial issues addressed at Mount Vernon. The Mount Vernon Conference, Annapolis met to try to iron out some financial difficulties. But I think, and honestly, here's a philosophical thing about this. Often it's said that these are failures, but I don't know that they're actually legitimate to do anything constitutionally, because there's this theory in America that if you're going to do a constitution rewrite or create a constitution, there has to be some sort of constituent input. By that, I don't mean like people that elect you. I'm speaking of the constituent body of the people have to have input into any organization that would meet to do a constitution. The Mount Vernon Conference was not an agenda to do a constitution, and nor were the people that went there sent there by, quote, the people. And we can debate about what the people are, but Annapolis and Mount Vernon were not, I don't believe theoretically they could do anything constitutionally, because the people didn't send them or create them to go there for any purpose.
Well, if I can be so bold and to ask you maybe to try to express, the thoughts of the common man of 1785, 86. I'm just curious, is there anger, if we want to call it that, frustration, angst, whatever it is it more towards the Confederation Congress, or is it more towards their states, or is it evenly divided? Or
well, the most direct anger is states. And all these agrarian unrest movements around the country are a clear example of that. Western Massachusetts, they're livid with their state legislature about their debt policy and their taxation policy. So a lot of the anger is at the states, because that's where most of the legislation is being passed that angers people. The Articles of Congress barely meets, and when they do meet, they often don't even have a quorum. So to get angry at them for their inability to do anything is a little disingenuous, because they can't do anything. So I think most of it is at the state level.
And could that be used to explain why there is general acceptance of increasing the power of a national legislature?
Well, sure. I think everybody wants some change. Everybody wants reform. They're divided. Eventually, this will show up in the Federalist, anti-Federalist debates. Okay, everybody agreed we need to tweak the articles, and that's why we sent you to Philadelphia. But a whole new constitution, that's different. So I would, I can't put a percentage on it, but the way I read the newspapers at that time, most everybody acknowledges we need a tweak. That's how I see it.
So, Professor Kavanaugh, I need you to hang with me for a minute here, and I'm going to try to be as clear as I can possibly be, which is always dangerous. So I've always believed, all right, which is a dangerous area again. I've always believed that the necessary and proper clause was kind of a backdoor way by Madison and compadres to give Congress the power that would be needed in such a large and diverse republic, and that would also allow the nation to have the flexibility to adapt to changes, which is, it seems, what he wanted in his Virginia plan. So are you with me on now? Is this kind of a sneaky thing, or no, Dave, you're a 21st century conspiracy thing?
Well, I wouldn't put Madison's name on it. I would put James Wilson's name on it. James Wilson was on the committee of detail that actually did this. And if you go back and I've spoken about Wilson before on the show, and I think he's definitely one of the underrated of the framers. He was very active at the convention, very active at the Pennsylvania ratifying convention, as well as a leading Federalist. But if you go back and look prior even to the Constitution, here was a guy, as a very famous jurist in America, was advocating for implied powers. You know, he was advocating for a national bank prior to the Constitution. So if you're going to have a government, well, the government's going to, even a limited national government under the Articles, you're going to borrow money. You got to put the money somewhere. Obviously, this is long before we had electronic transfers and no real money actually ever changed hands anymore. But so he's arguing for implied powers prior to the Constitution. Well, guess what? He's on the Committee on Detail, and it comes up with the necessary and proper clause. And there's no pushback at the convention. As a matter of fact, Tim and I were just speaking before we recorded. There was no pushback when the Committee of Detail presented the plan at the convention, and it passed unanimously. It wasn't until after the document as a whole is put out that you're going to start to get pushback from, again, at dinner parties from anti-Federalists about that very nature of it. So I don't know that there was a Madison and all his buddies behind closed doors, like, oh, we're going to stick it to these states now.
Can I explain myself? And I'm going to need your help, because one, we know that.
Goody.
You're in trouble.
Yeah. Well, one, we know that, in his Virginia plan, we have a national veto over the states. Am I also correct in understanding that there's an element or an essence of plenary power in the national legislature under the Virginia plan?
I think that absolutely there is, and they would believe this too. And actually, I was listening to a podcast today, and I'm not sure if this fits, but it was very interesting, because here's Madison at the Virginia ratifying convention saying the Constitution is what it says. These are the words, and this is how we're going to move forward with it. So it's, the necessary and proper. I know you're upset, but, it's not as bad as what you think it is. But if you go to in Poughkeepsie in New York, in the New York ratifying convention, here's Hamilton and Jay. Their vision of what they see is different than perhaps what Madison is advocating for in Virginia. So I think it's interesting, because the scholar that was speaking said, maybe there were two different constitutions. in regards to the one that they were advocating for in Virginia, and then the one that the Federalists were advocating for in New York. And I would say that plenary power much more on the mind of Hamilton and Jay, Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, just to name drop a few people. So I would say yes to a degree.
I think I would see you raised the national veto, which is a great point. But I think in a strict sense, I've always thought about the national veto proposal of Madison becoming more the supremacy clause than the necessary and proper clause. Now, it is interesting, to your point, David, that a lot of the anti-Federalists, when they're railing against the necessary and proper clause, or they're railing against the supremacy clause, they always put the two clauses together, as these are dangerous clauses. So the anti-Federalists do kind of see these two clauses as, well, obviously they seem as dangerous, but they often in the same piece will combine them as a part of the same argument.
Well, David, I'm sorry to, but there's an interesting piece. So I'm going to share it in the resources, and for the students on this question, I really hope that you get a chance to dive through this. Is from a scholar named John McHale. And he says that there are actually three necessary and proper clauses, depending on how you read it. So Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper, carrying in the execution of the foregoing powers, right? So the power is listed before it. But then he says Congress shall make all laws that have been necessary and proper carrying into execution all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States. I think therein lies what you're pointing about the plenary power. And he goes on to believe that that second necessary and proper clause, if you will, is probably the most important one in terms of giving this government a greater or a broader power. And of course, the third one is all powers vested by this Constitution in any department or officer of the United States. So it's an interesting way to break up the necessary and proper clause. But I think, I don't know, there was not a secret cabal that said, oh, we're going to do this. But I think it, after the fact, and as Tim alluded to, the supremacy clause, along with the necessary and proper, tend to make a lot of anti-federalists apoplectic.
Well,
I'm glad you said that.
It's interesting. Chris raises the proposition that there may be 3 necessary and proper clauses in the Constitution. I would make the argument, if you look, slow down when you read the Articles of Confederation, that there's a couple, 2 or 3 necessary and proper clause. I think I jotted these down this morning. In Article 6, Congress kind of has a necessary and proper power in their judgment. And this is related to whether they think building navies and supplying, it had to do with military powers. So there was this clause that sounds pretty loosey-goosey, like necessary and proper. In Article 9, when Congress wasn't in session, there was a Committee of the States, and there was a statement in there that the Committee of States in the recession of Congress could do expedient measures. There's another one in Article 10. Again, it's an expediency type statement. So in the articles, they're on the verge of saying necessary and proper in different ways. So I guess to kind of push back on this is a cabal that happened at Philadelphia, it may be that they're just formalizing in a single phrase some of the, quote, cryptic necessary and proper clauses that are actually in the articles.
Well, I very much appreciate Mr. Kavanaugh reading the entire clause and differentiating in the language, because I've always found that fascinating. And Professor Williams, I guess what I'm wondering, do other nations have some similar language or a similar approach to this? Everything, again, we've got this necessary and proper clause, which is really going to explode onto the scene, as we'll talk later in the 20th century. And so I'm wondering, how do other constitutions provide for flexibility in their governing structure and approach to, the evolution of society?
Yeah. It's a little embarrassing because when I was prepping for this question, I'd never looked into it. And my go-to was like, well, yeah, they have to have something similar, right? And turns out they do. Because it seems to me like, the students should think about, one of the reasons written constitutions are important, I think, is because you need to spell out what powers different branches have. What are the rules going to be? But at the same time, you need a constitution that is going to be flexible enough to change with the times. And it seems to me it's that second point where, in being the first society in the world to set up a constitutional democracy, we haven't benefited from the experiences that other societies as they have watched us try to deal with our documents. So there's a few really interesting examples. I'll just share a couple. Canada and Australia have in their constitution something that is referred to as Commonwealth power. And then it's specifically that the government has the power to make any laws that are necessary for the peace, order, and good governance. And that is the equivalent of necessary and proper. It attaches not only to enumerated powers, but there's also in the Canadian Constitution an emergency provision where if there's any power that's delegated to the provinces, this peace, order, and good governance can overrule, like the national government can just overtake a provincial function. And there's also a doctrine that's been developed by the courts called the national concerns doctrine. And this is something that's not a temporary emergency. It's where the courts just kind of decide, well, there's this issue that was given to the provinces in the 1870 Constitution, but you know what? This is really of national interest now. So the national government gets to do it through this peace, order, and good governance clause. A sociologist, C. Martin Lipset, has written a book on Canada, and he's argued that this idea of peace, order, and good governance is the equivalent of what in the United States kind of constitutional myth in terms of totally losing it.
Sounds like the general welfare clause to me.
No, he says it's the equivalent of the pursuit of happiness, right? It's the equivalent of that's the myth that's around this. So I think it's super interesting. So yes, there are numerous constitutions. India allows it, Germany allows it, South Africa allows it. The final thing I'll say on this, I think that students should see how this relates to the enumeration of powers, right? So what's unique about the United States Constitution actually isn't the necessary and proper clause. It's that we have this enumerated list of powers just for the national government. And then Article 1, I think Section 10, right, says there are certain things states can't do. You couple that with the 10th Amendment that says, okay, anything not given to the national government goes to the states and to the people, right? We'll leave that aside for a second. Most other constitutions, even if they have enumerated powers for the state and for the provinces, this elastic clause, this equivalent of necessary and proper, it says even if we are giving powers to the state, provincial governments, we can still take it away. So it's much more specific and it's not as wide open. Most other constitutions tell provinces, states, and local governments exactly what they can do. And in our constitutional scheme, we just say this is what the national government can do. Everything else falls to state and local. So there's a wider grant of power to the subunits. And so we are actually way more constrained than other countries because we always have to link the necessary and proper back to the enumerated, right? Yeah. And the other countries I'm talking about, South Africa, Canada, Germany, India, they don't have to do that. They have a fuller grant of power. So as societies become more complex, as issues become more complex, as attitudes about what government should do kind of mature, I know we're going to talk to like this clause in the 20th century. I think the reason it's so contentious for us is because we're very limited by what the text allows the government to do, unlike other countries where there's built-in flexibility. We can argue whether that flexibility is dangerous, but that flexibility is there for a reason, I think, and it's recognizing that times change and you may want a national government to do more than you envisioned at the time of writing the Constitution. So I hope that wasn't too confusing. I know I said a lot.
I thought that was excellently presented there. So Tim, I'm not going to take you too far out of your comfort zone. I'd like to go into the 19th century now. And if we can just kind of keep it in the 19th century here for this part of the conversation. I'm wondering if the anti-Federalist views about the necessary and proper clause, did their fears come to fruition in the 19th century, or did it function how Hamilton said it would, sincerely or not, or propaganda or not, however we want to call it, in Federalist Paper number 33? Because it seems like paper number 33, he's trying to calm these fears. So
right. 33 is like, don't worry about it. It's and he articulates it's connected. Mike's point, it's connected to the previous 17 clauses. It's kind of if we want to get any of those 17 done, then we have to pass future legislation to do any of those 17. So it's not an infinite number of powers. It's only kind of an enacting power of the previous 17. That's Fed 33. But to your question, I think it's worse because I mean, I guess when I think about this question, I think really what's important in the 19th century is McCulloch, the McCulloch case. And there are some others, but I think the students really should dig into, because this is the first really big case where the necessary and proper clause comes into question. And so to your point is, did anti-Federalists foresee their fears to become true? Well, there's also a Federalist who has some fears about how Marshall's interpreting too. There are two great letters that are written to both to Spencer Rowan. One's by Jefferson, one's by Madison. So, and they're just livid with Marshall's use of necessary and proper clause in the McCulloch case. In McCulloch, Marshall says he says this is a means to the ends. This bank, which it was a fight back in the very early administration of Washington, this bank is a means to an end. Okay, so what are the ends? In other words, let's look at the previous 17 statements in Article 1, Section 8. So for him, you have a bank that kind of equals commerce, that regulating commerce and trade and coining money. He makes this economic argument that bank is embedded in those phrases in Article 1, Section 8. So it's only a means to an end. That doesn't mean it's infinite numbers of powers. Well, these letters from one from Madison, so he's the Federalist. He's a Federalist back in the 1780s, right? He doesn't like this argument. And then of course Jefferson doesn't like it because for a lot of reasons. But the letters are interesting because they're critical of Marshall, but for different reasons. Madison's argument is he's gone way too far with these means to an end. He sees this infinite number. It'll never end because Congress, he calls a creative Congress, will find all kinds of means to those ends, and it'll never end. Jefferson's letter to Rowan points out, hey, maybe all three, this is the coordinate branch argument that Jefferson was famous for. Maybe each branch should interpret the Constitution for themselves in their own department. So the letters are different criticisms, but they both are really, really troubled by Marshall's use of the means to the ends argument that he does in McCulloch.
So I am wondering, and maybe Chris, you'll want to jump in on this with Tim. I am wondering, is there a case in which the court, whether it's the Marshall Court or the Taney Court, slaps Congress down, all right, as they attempt to use the implied powers doctrine that we see come out of the necessary and proper clause? I'm just wondering, is there this anti-Federalist, no, Congress, you can't do that? And I'll be honest, I don't know if Dred Scott gets into that with the Missouri Compromise. You guys are much more knowledgeable on that. But I'm wondering if there's any time in the 19th century, especially pre-Civil War, in which the court says, no, you can't do that, Congress.
None come to mind for me. And I don't think necessary proper comes up in Dred Scott.
Necessary and proper is not in Dred, but I can't think of any, David, off the top of my head. But I want to go back on a couple of things with what Tim was saying. Because I've got a book open here, the Anti-Federalist dreaded because this is quoting, an axiom is more clearly established. No axiom is more clearly established in law than wherever the end is required, the means are authorized. So I think that's referring to that. And I want to go back to Madison too, because this is where there's some inconsistency in Madison here, because in this specific instance is because we talked about this on the other show about the ability to dismiss cabinet members. And is this something the president has the unilateral authority to do? Does he have to get the Senate approval? And again, it's not in the Constitution, but the argument is finally made. Madison actually makes the argument that the president should have the ability to get rid of the person if the president wants. But then the national bank rolls around, and therein it's gone too far. So Madison, and I think for the students, I'll put a link for Fed 44. Madison, rolling around with the necessary and proper clause in that Federalist paper as well, trying to justify it. But Madison is a little inconsistent on this, and
he reauthorized that bank that was in question.
But he said, I think when he reauthorizes, well, it's been through the court, it's been through the people. Clearly, this is the will of the people. This is the will of the court. So, the heck with it, I'm done fighting it. So he is a little inconsistent on that. But I think that therein lies the word proper, because when the word proper is put in there, who decides? And this becomes an issue perhaps for the courts to decide, for the legislature itself, and for the people ultimately. And this is Madison's explanation about that.
That appears in the letter from Jefferson to Roane too. The proper piece is in question.
So, but to your question, David, I can't think of any time when the court, up to that point, pre-Civil War, slaps down Congress for going too far. Do you know of any off the top of your head? I don't know.
No, I can't. Well, again, just as a side note, what is the authority, the constitutional authority for the Missouri Compromise then? If it's not, is it that's what I'm wondering. If it's not necessary and proper to carry out the foregoing powers, which I would imagine are partly commercial, or
well, don't forget that if that's the second part of the clause itself, because not only for the foregoing powers, but all other powers given to this in the Constitution, and the ability of Congress to deal with territorial property.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Congress has that authority under Article 4 to deal with the territories, and it is clear in the necessary and proper. So I think the foregoing powers obviously is looking forward, and the other parts are going afterward. And I'm thinking of and Tim, you're going to have to help me out because I'm going to be way out of my depth. But didn't the Virginia House of Burgesses they're pretty upset about the state assumptions, and they wrote a resolution, I think in 1790, criticizing Hamilton for going too far, because there's nowhere in the Constitution do you have this authority to assume these state debts. And as I understand it, Hamilton actually sends the resolution to Jay, who this time is Chief Justice, and Jay's like, "Don't worry, enough people are going to come around to support the assumption of these debts, and you'll have plenty of advocates for that. And this is, it's going to go by the wayside." But Hamilton was like, if we buy into this thinking, it's going to gut all constitutional power. It's going to be very difficult for this Congress to move forward and to make any gains. So am I getting that right, Tim?
Yep. Well, and David, I think to your, I have to get a cheap shot in here. I think there's enough criticism of Marshall's interpretation of the contract and commercial clauses. I think much more valid than the criticisms of his use and interpretation of necessary and proper. Like, you think about how creative he got in the Dartmouth college case, that a contract, this is a colonial contract, and he goes through these long contorted explanations why a colonial contract is still valid and can't be changed after we become a country. He gets real creative in Gibbons in what commerce equals. So I think there's enough other clauses that he gets creative with and flexible in his interpretation. There's enough criticism in those other decisions that, in my view, way overshadow the criticisms when you add them all up that were leveled at Marshall on the McCulloch case. So he got creative with other clauses as well.
So, well, I'm wondering, Chris, on this doctrine of implied powers, that doctrine would exist whether or not the necessary and proper clause exists, right? You would still be able to formulate an implied powers doctrine without clause 18.
Oh, well, where's Jefferson get the authority to say, yeah, we'll take that Louisiana territory off your hands? So early on, we're gonna confront the assumptions debate that I just mentioned. So whether the clause is in there or not, the debates were coming, because now you've got a government. The government's got to function. We did our program on the first Congress not too long ago, and holy cow, all the stuff that they had to do within the first Congress. And can we do this? And I think we mentioned on that program again about the ability to dismiss somebody. It's not in the Constitution. Oops.
So when
how they're going to interpret that moving forward really sets the tone. So of course we're going to have arguments about, can the government do this or not, and where does the government get the power within the document to do whatever it chooses to do.
well, let's
in that first Congress, they were talking about the post office, and the issue came up is, can we as Congress create laws penalizing people that steal mails on the post roads? Well, yeah, I would think so. If you had the power to create post roads, wouldn't it follow that you could create laws punishing people that stole mail? There's that implied power. To your question about implied powers, they talked about implied powers all the time in that first Congress.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, okay, so we get into the political debate, the Federalist, anti-Federalist. Is this one of those moments in which the Federalists have that sly grin on their face? Oh, enumerated powers, don't worry, it limits legislative authority.
Yes, because the anti-Federalists, I think philosophically, are saying, look, necessary and proper gives us a British Constitution. Don't talk to us about limited powers, enumerated powers. So that's their argument. We're British. Stop it. We don't want to be that. British constitutionalism, we've rejected that.
So they're just asking the Federalists, let's be open and honest about it up front, and let's debate whether or not we want to be British constitutionalism versus what this,
Well, if you frame it that way, there's no debate, but
okay, too open and honest there. Right? Yeah, Chris.
I just one word in two different places in this clause, as well as the 10th Amendment, could have changed the word expressly. I mean, oh my goodness, if they had, and I think in that resolution that the House of Burgesses were complaining about the assumptions, they use the word expressly. And we know that with the 10th Amendment, if the word expressly had been put in there, but it's not. So we debate, we don't argue. So holy cow, that would have changed everything, I think.
Well, and that argument is, again, it to me explodes in the 20th century. And we're kind of going to circle back, because we talked a little bit about plenary power in the national legislature. And it seems to me, Chris, the use of the necessary and proper clause in the 20th century, now we're moving just into the 20th century, has effectively, it was effectively, kind of evolved into plenary power. If we look at the fact that my understanding is from 1937 to 1995, almost 60 years, the courts don't strike down a single act of Congress, all right, in which they are using the necessary and proper attached to some other power there. 60 years, all right, during a very dynamic century where the court says, yes, Congress, yes, Congress, yes, Congress, which in my understanding, that's virtually plenary power. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you have to add on, I don't disagree with you, but I think you have to add on the enforcement clauses in the amendments following the Civil War. I think those read very much like necessary and proper clauses, because I think Congress have the necessary authority to enact appropriate legislation I'm butchering it. I should know off the top of my head. Let me just check my handy dandy pocket nerd constitution here. And the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Who decides it's appropriate?
Yeah. Back to our favorite word, appropriate.
Yes. So yeah, I agree with you that the courts have been hands off. But again, when the government takes action, where can you find in the Constitution? And we know that, well, the Civil Rights Act of '64 is supporting the 14th Amendment. Congress has the authority to do that. We know that certain voting rights acts were, supporting the 15th Amendment.
Well, and I think what's interesting, Mike, is that it seems to set up the late 20th and 21st century constitutional debate. And I'm going to poke Professor Moore in a little bit. Let's assume for a moment that today's Republicans are the anti-Federalists, because it seems that at a core of the Republican Party is runaway power of the national legislature there. Do you see their point? That at least if we go back to the writing, to the convention, to the debates and stuff, that what the anti-Federalists feared in the late 18th century came true in the late 20th and early 21st. And so really their revolution of constitutional interpretation that they're now able to implement is to tear apart or go move, I don't know if it's backwards, or I think you know where I'm going there on this. Do you think they have a point there from that perspective of an anti-Federalist?
Yeah, I think the key word in there for me is this ongoing debate between the anti-Federalists and Federalists. And because, I mean, as Tim and Chris and you were talking earlier, I mean, Jefferson, Marshall, and Madison couldn't agree on this thing before the ink had hardly dried on it. So this has been an ongoing debate. So when you talk about misuse of power, I think it depends on where you're sitting and what's your point of view is. Now, is the government as limited now as it was in the 1790s? Probably not. Probably not. I don't know if that means that the modern day Republicans can carry the flag of the anti-Federalists, because modern day Republicans, just as modern day Democrats, when it's to their political advantage, will want to use implied powers or use other, just anything else, right? To push, to expand power. But it seems to me a couple things. I'm always struck by what a student told me once. I think I've mentioned this before, when they were studying, taking an American politics class abroad one time, and the class was entitled "The Rise and Fall of the American Empire," right? So this notion of seeing American history through this idea of empire making. And we've alluded to this on the show with the War in 1898 and the beginning of the American empire in the 20th century. And it seems to me like that period that you were just raising, the 60-year period where the courts never told Congress not to do it, right? That also, as we all know, we've talked about it, correlates with the rise of executive power. And I think that there's something going on that's beyond just the constitutional text. Like, America is becoming a superpower. And with that comes, I think, a necessity to expand the powers of what the national government's going to legislate on. I don't see how you become an empire and not do that. And that could be its own concern off to the side. But it seems to me that if you look in history, both Democrats and Republicans have been part of building the empire. So to now argue that this is going against our founding principles, to me, one, I think that the founding principles are debatable on this. And two, I just think that given where we are as a society today, yes, there needs to be limits for sure. But I think that that's where actual people come in. The society must come in to some extent and to say, wait, this doesn't jive with where we're at. And ultimately, we tend to have these discussions about just these political elites pushing back, right? But there's a role for ordinary people to kind of argue about what the limits of the government should be. And I think sometimes we lose track of that.
Well,
your 60-year period window, David's really a great thought, because I mean, Congress gets real flexible with NASA. This where they create the law that created NASA. There's this preface before they get to the actual details of the law where they say, "We're doing this because this is a military. This is a part of our military powers." So they flexibly interpret their military power. They're doing constitutional review, actually, I think, we have the authority to create NASA because it fits under this, our military powers in Article 1, Section 8. Well, that's kind of flexible. They don't even need the necessary and proper clause if they're going to be that flexible in how, and there's a lot of laws like that in that 60-year window that you're talking about, David. They don't even need the necessary and proper clause. They're flexible in what they want to do with their powers without it.
That's such a good point. I wonder if today the argument would be made like it'd be a commerce and not like we need we need space travel and we're going to regulate it because
the minute there's a poker game on the space station, it now is commerce. Good point.
I like that. Well, just so I feel better about myself as we come to the end of our winter spring sessions here, Professor Williams. Yeah, I've been a little facetious to attach the Republicans to the anti-Federalists, but you would agree with me, whether it's sincere or not, it is a core part of the plank of the Republican Party that there's a runaway national government over, too much regulation, too many laws. And again, they like to reference and attach themselves to this limited government, I think, to a greater degree anti-federal. Sorry, you would agree that we can read it that way.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that you'd have to be, all political elites are going to play the limited government card when they want to, because it resonates. I mean, it's part of our origin story. The Democrats did it in the 50s and 60s with civil rights. So, yeah, I mean, it's in terms of like saying that the state should have control over what they're doing and the Fed shouldn't get involved. So it seems to me that I don't think we should be surprised that that card is being played. I think it's interesting to ask, given how much society has changed the last 250 years, why it still resonates like it does and why it resonates on some issues and not others, right? I'm thinking of a lot of legislation that Republicans and Democrats are behind that would rankle anti-Federalists, but they do just because it's popular with their constituents. So,
well, I just think it reinforces what I've learned from the three of you in the time that we've spent over the last few years, talking, is that in the last analysis, students, you can make any argument you want, irregardless of what the words say in the Constitution, because members of Congress have been doing that for over 200 years. And that it's, we can call it nuanced, we can, whatever phrase you want to make it. But what I've learned from these guys is, hey, make the argument, throw some attachment to something in the Constitution, and who knows what the court's going to do with it, because the court makes it up as they go along anyway. There kind of thing. So I think as we come to the end, that's a way to think there. Chris, I can't tell if you want to jump out of the frame there and punch me in the nose.
No, I'm just trying to, my lighting is not very good, which is good. So it's good for me not to be well lit. I think I would agree with you, Dave, but I think and Mike said this, I think it just depends on the issue. Everybody wants to play that limited government, but until they don't. Case in point would be, obviously, we're recording this after we know that former President Trump has been indicted in New York, and now you see Republicans in Congress trying to micromanage the Southern District of New York's prosecutor's office, which they really don't have the authority to do. So we like to preach limited government until we don't. Kind of like the court, right? We don't handle political questions until we do. So,
but it is good that we're talking about a piece of text, though.
Yes.
Text matters to a point. Our history. We are talking about a set of words, and I think that's important. And frankly, I kind of liken it to the rabbinic tradition. We have this text, and there's all these rabbinic traditions that evolved since the text was, come down from Mount Sinai, and you got all these different schools of thinking about it. So but we are talking about a text, and I think that is important.
Thank you, Mr. Madison.
Well, I'm going to say if we have another season of this, I'm going to start calling him Rabbi more here, Malzatov kind of thing.
I don't know, for an Irish guy who's now Protestant, I don't know. That's a bridge too far, isn't it?
Well, who knows? Who knows? Kind of stuff.
You're the
All
king of
right,
the spectrum, so that's a hell of a
Okay.
spectrum right there.
Yeah. Well, students and teachers, hopefully you see once again just how much, I mean, I can speak for myself. I can't speak for the other three. How much I enjoy learning and chatting with these three scholars. And there's not a day moment in this that goes by that I don't learn something new, and I'm not moved to go do some more research and reading. So to finish this season in the tradition that we have established, I'd like our three scholars to provide some final thoughts, insights, recommendations about this question on the necessary and proper clause. And we'll start with you, Mr. Kavanaugh, as you are quickly moving into the dark.
Yeah. Well, I've been in the dark for a long time.
But you've been lit at times that you've been in the dark. So
this is true too. This is true too.
We won't comment on that.
Yeah,
a bridge too far.
take a pitch.
I'm sorry, I just found out the Dodgers lost again. So I'm discombobulated. Go ahead, Mr. Kavanaugh.
Where am I? What's it? Yeah. So I think this is a difficult question to deal with because there's some disconnected tissue here within the question. So again, this is very much, the first part is very much a history question, because now it's asking you to dive into the where did this come from? Why did they have this? So I think there's the history question there. Then there's the practical application, how they use it. And the last bullet kind of throws me for a loop in terms of like the impactfulness of the concept of implied powers. I do believe there are implied powers or inherent powers. And I would go back to my boy, James Wilson, pre-Constitution, that governments do have implied powers. I think, the last bullet just sets up an argument between enumerated powers and what are implied powers. And I think Mike mentioned this earlier. My goodness, the guys that wrote the darn thing were arguing about it as soon as it's put into practice. How are we not going to argue about it? So students, good luck with this question.
Professor Moore.
Yeah, I think students would be well served to really maybe even memorize Article 1, Section 8. Because I think really the question, I mean, it's framed within necessary and proper, but I think a really full-orbed understanding of this and being well prepared for nationals, that you really know what all the enumerated powers are and how those have evolved. I mean, latent in this, there's kind of a constitutionalism theory behind this. How do we interpret words, whether they be necessary and proper or, a militia clause in Article 1, Section 8. So I would really strongly urge them to be very steeped in all the powers of Congress, not just necessary and proper.
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I'm going to go off into a completely different track here and say, I learned a lot by thinking about these comparative examples. So I don't think, I wouldn't spend a lot of time with that, but I think looking at comparative examples, how more recent constitutions are outlining powers and how they are making room for flexibility, we'll put those in the resources. I think you should just have those in mind. And I also think that, as Tim was saying, I agree that words matter, but the origin story we have about those words also matter. So it seems to me, I just can't help think about South Africa's constitution in 1996, where one of the main stated purposes of the Constitution is to promote reconciliation, which is a different starting point than saying, let's create a constitution that is not going to, it's going to prevent tyranny. So from that origin point, yes, David's right. You can argue and debate anything related to the text, but that cultural sort of, text behind it is important, and it kind of constrains what arguments you can make in the political arena. So I would just kind of think about that as well as you're thinking about these words.
Well, students and teachers, from the FOPS, we wish you all the best of luck as you travel to Virginia for the national finals. We hope that we've helped to some degree. All right. We hope that we have provided a necessary and proper framework for you to approach your questions and your dialogue with the judges. It just might be possible that you could run into one or two or three or four of the FOPs there at national finals. Who knows there. Teachers, we don't know about the future, whether or not we'll be back in the summer, fall. There, we'll talk about it. We're all getting older, and some of us, losing our academic and intellectual ability there. But of course, we will let you know what's coming up in the future. You have good time at national finals, and just appreciate the experience and appreciate the moment. I can tell you, as a former teacher from California who got to go back to nationals, it's still one of the treasured memories that I have. So until next time, peace, love, Yugger tacos. Bye-bye, bye-bye.